transportation, the urbanization, the water, and the energy. And because 9 out of 10 of the people claim they would be willing to make further changes to their daily habits once they did find out what their actual carbon footprint is, so we want to provide them with solutions that actually work, solutions that will make differences. And in fact, those solutions are already with us. So our job is to make sure that we deliver them successfully to the communities that we serve. Starting off with transportation. So 47% of people feel that transportation is the most carbon intensive activity of their day. So what has DAR done in the MENA region so far and across the world is that we have provided solutions for the transportation sectors. What you see here is a whole set of solutions that we've been working with. Solutions that will make sure that we're cutting down on the emissions of all of the transportation activities, whether it's related to mass transit, whether it's related to individual transit solutions and others. All in all, we are in support of building sustainable infrastructure. We have the expertise to do it, and that aligns with our commitment towards net zero by 2030. That's a great example of what sustainable transport looks like. This is the Cairo Metro Line, which has won the Engineering News Record 2021 Global Project of the Year as a rail and transit application. Moving to buildings. So in terms of the built environment, our focus is whatever the sustainability targets of the clients would be, we design for sustainable built environments. Whether it's buildings, it's infrastructure, the minimum is sustainable compliance for us. And our priorities is really an integrated approach between buildings and infrastructure, the high performance urban spaces, renewable energy, the low carbon structure. So we've moved beyond just the operational energy to also tackle the embodied energy due to our commitment. And we also are looking at retrofitting existing facilities. So it's not only the new, but it's also the existing, because there's a lot of emissions that are actually associated with existing markets. And one great example that you'll see here is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia Pavilion at Dubai Expo 2020, where COP28 will happen next year. And that's a LEED Platinum certified project that has won the Emirates Innovation Award. Another great project here in Cairo is the Central Business District at the new administrative capital in Cairo, and that is the first smart, sustainable project in not only in Egypt but also in the whole of Africa that we're very proud of, actually. On the resources, so we also make sustainable choices effortless for consumers at the level of the resources. And when we speak about resources, we speak about water, we speak about energy, about renewable energy, and the integration between them, whether in terms of implementation or in terms of operational aspects. And one very important thing, actually two very important things, are policy and the need for policy to align and to let this happen, and also the need to have training and capacity building to make sure they continue to operate sustainably. And there's the example that our chairman referred to, the renewable energy project in Africa, in Angola specifically, that was servicing more than 1 million people around the world. So at DAR, we believe that to reach net zero, we have to make the sustainable choices as affordable, as accessible, and as desirable as possible. And that's when and how this will happen, and we will make it happen. Thank you. And now over to you.
Also, why don't you stay up on stage? Hi everyone. My name's Richard. I'm with Integral Group. I am the Climate and Sustainability Lead from Integral. We're a member of the DAR Group for DAR globally. I'm going to moderate your discussion today, and I'm going to ask some exceptional people to come up and join Balsam on stage. So first up, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind. Stephen Anderson is the Middle East Strategy and Markets Leader for PwC. He is also a finance and ESG expert. So when you think of your questions as they relate to the financial sector, Stephen is your man. I'd also invite Faisal Shayer to come and join us. Now, Faisal is our digital twin lead at DAR. He's also been instrumental in the development of Para, which is a digital twin tool for connecting the design process into the sort of low carbon buildings in practice. And then finally, my dear friend Victoria Burrows. Victoria's Director of Advancing Net Zero at the World Green Building Council. An extraordinary leader in our sector, a visionary, someone who I can remember, I mean, how many years ago, Victoria? It was 5, 6 years ago in Australia, you first pitching net zero to me, and what a journey you've been on since. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome our panelists, please? Now, I have a whole bunch of questions here, but if there's anything burning that you absolutely need answered, please just raise a hand and I'll come to you and we can have a proper conversation. I think in many ways, some of the challenges of events like this is you end up with just being soaked in the same stories about the urgency of the crisis and the criticality, and I mean, we've got thousands of people here, but this session's about integrated solutions in the built environment. And we know that the built environment is of critical importance. The stuff that people build. We build stuff as a species for thousands and thousands of years. What have we done as people? We have built stuff. Well, these are the people who build stuff and design the stuff to be built. And if we're going to do it differently, this is the session to dive into how might we actually do it differently. I'm going to start with everybody on the panel, though, and ask for some opening remarks. So this is your chance. You're going to get another chance at the end. But this is your chance to say, well, where are we at? A quick reflection. Where are we at? When we get to the end, cheat sheet, I'm going to ask you, where are we going? So let's just start with where we're at. I'm just going to pass the mic down the chain. So Balsam, first up, when you think about the built environment and climate change, are we behind the game? Are we in front of the game as a sector? How are we going?
Thank you, Richard. So we're definitely not in front of the game, that's for sure. We are behind, and well, not very much behind, but still we are behind. But there's still hope for us to act, and hence why the importance of all of the discussions that are happening here at COP27 about the need and the urgency for quick implementation. What the UN General Secretary said in his talk 2 days ago is that the 1.5 degree target is on support, it's on health support, yep. And what this means that it's at risk, but what also this means it still has chance, right? And that's why we're here today, to really lay out the solutions that we've been working with, that we believe are implementable, realistic solutions, affordable solutions, as we've mentioned, and to really get it back on track as it should be for 2030 and then for 2050.
Same question. Where are we at? I guess, and more broadly in terms of where this COP's at and where we're at as a planet, we're clearly far from where we need to be. I think is the obvious answer. I think we're way behind. I think we do an analysis every year. It's called the Net Zero Economy Index, and it basically looks at what's the level of decarbonisation that needs to happen for us to be able to get close to this 1.5 target. This year we should have decarbonised. This fly seems to be following me all around the. We should have decarbonised by around 15% to be on track. We need to do that every year for the next ad infinitum. This year we hit about 0.5. So clearly we're way behind. I think it's slightly more interesting. My first COP, we were talking about this earlier, my first COP was in 2012, so 10 years ago in Doha, so at COP18. If the level of interest, level of change that's going to happen is sort of mimics the scale of the COP, if only, then clearly this is now has much more attention, there's much more momentum behind it, although I am slightly sceptical about whether we're going to get the sorts of breakthroughs we want to get this time round. But let's see. But I guess the quick answer is not where we need to be.
I think I'll go quickly with this one, but from the digital angle, what we want is we want to see clients and stakeholders embrace data and digital, because especially with decarbonization in the operational phase, it's all about data and what you can do to leverage that data to understand where the underperforming areas are and come up with a proper decarbonization plan, right? So these digital solutions are out there, and it's our job really to help support uptake.
Okay, so to the question about how are we doing, clearly not very well. And the numbers on the board here have gone up since last year, right? The global status report from the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction tells us that emissions from the sector are actually rising, despite all of the efforts of all of us to try and increase that awareness. And part of the problem, I think, is that we're in a long game for the nature of the building and construction sector, right? The designs that we implement today won't be materializing for several years. And so, you know, funding cycles, policy cycles, they don't scratch the surface of the reality of embedding those concepts into building and construction, and especially infrastructure projects. For me, I think it's a knowledge gap. Because if you talk to the investors, they'll say, if you talk to the people implementing the projects, they'll say the money's not there. And if you talk to the investors, they'll say, where's the projects, right? So it comes down to a knowledge gap. So I'm still hopeful. We're here again in another COP, still hopeful, still optimistic we can really be pushing that message. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do.
Now, hey, rock and roll. Victoria, since you've got it, let's stay with you. Your net zero thing, MENA, where we are, how is it going? How are you finding the appetite and sort of general level of ambition in this region as it relates to the built environment specifically and that decarbonization trajectory?
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely the engagement with concepts like net zero varies region to region, but there are some organizations within the Middle East that have signed up to the commitment, of course, DAR being one of them, AESG, also Majid at the time were the first signatory to the net zero carbon buildings commitment. So again, the ambition's there, the intent to do something better with the sector's there, and it's becoming about knowledge, and what I'm hearing from organizations functioning in this space is that the demand is increasing. I don't know how you're finding, but we're finding that clients are going to these organizations saying, okay, about this net zero thing, like, how do I do it?
How do I do it?
How do I do it? Last month, no wait, where are we? November. In September for World Green Building Week, I can barely remember what country I'm in, let alone what month or day it is, but we were in Dubai for World Green Building Week and hosting events at ICD Brickfield Place, which is a building that will be net zero and has been designed to be extremely efficient. So again, we know it's possible. The proof of the possible is in the region, and I find examples everywhere I travel in MENA, so it's about elevating those examples to prove that it's possible, and it doesn't necessarily have to come with a high price tag either.
So speaking of price tags, Stephen, we've spoken about finance, and we hear all the time about how finance is a barrier. I'm slightly unconvinced that finance is as big a barrier as it's sometimes made out to be. But as you think about the need and the mechanisms for how we get higher ambition, how we move these projects forward, how do you see the finance industry responding, and what sorts of tools and ambition do you see coming from that side?
Sure. Let me back up slightly for a moment and just maybe just relay just the level of opportunity. I agree. The opportunities are out there in terms of green projects and green investments in our region. Around the world, capital is pouring into these projects around the world. It's not necessarily pouring into projects here in the region, so there's clearly a gap. Now, we did a bit of an analysis, and we took 6 sectors, and we said there are investable projects across each of these 6 sectors which could generate something like $2 trillion of GDP by 2050 and create something like 1 million jobs. So the opportunities in this region around some of those projects are enormous, and they will be in projects such as agriculture, in power, in construction, in transport, in waste management. The list goes on. Specifically, if you take a couple of those areas, and maybe you take something like waste management, which by definition is not the most glamorous topic to talk about, but if you look at the level of recycling in our region, it's roughly at about 10%. Global average is 40%. So if you could bridge that gap, there's probably something like a $6 billion GDP market there, another 50,000 jobs, huge opportunity in the region. You take green hydrogen, we think by 2050 the region could be producing something like 250 million tons of green hydrogen. That's about a $300 billion GDP opportunity. So the project should be there. The challenge is there's gap, as mentioned. At the macro level, there's probably 4 things that need to happen in our region, and some are going to sound a bit boring, so apologies for that. One is regulation, and actually having some standards and some regulation and policies in place that means there's some certainty for investors that things are going to be enforced. Secondly, there needs to be some more crowding in. So we recommended the sort of creation of a sort of green sovereign wealth funds in each of the sort of GCC countries that can act as a kind of catalyst to sort of drive some of that investment and throw that investment in. Our capital markets are getting deeper. So clearly what's been happening in the UAE, raft of IPOs, etc., that's going to help, but you really want to be driving that sort of green market. Green bonds in the region, green bonds make up about 0.3% of the global green bond market. And then finally, we don't have the level of reporting and accountability that you need in the region. So there's a raft of things to do. But that said, and I sounded a little bit pessimistic there, we believe, given those opportunities, I'm seeing way more appetite and people being prepared to take. I mean, bankers don't like this, and what they don't understand, they don't like to invest in. With the level of understanding that's coming, we're seeing a much more appetite to put finance into these projects, and I'm kind of hopeful. We'll see interest rates as another challenge. Whether you're right, I mean, net is the problem finance or bankable projects? Net is bankable projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Faisal, we're engineers, and so we design, and unfortunately, greenhouse gas emissions aren't emitted on the basis of designs. They are emitted by actual real projects in the actual real world. Now, that gap, that connection is obviously a very challenging one for us as professionals to get over, because we kind of hand our projects over. But you've been working in the digital twin space and in the data space for some time. So how do you see the digital twin and the digital environment serving as one of the key solutions within the built environment, and how we link up this design process where we exist and most of our colleagues exist as engineers with the real operational world and our clients who are making commitments like the kind that Victoria administers?
I think to answer that question, I'll start out with the definition of what the digital twin is, which is what we're doing. So it's a virtual representation of an asset, process, or system where you're able to model, visualize, and predict the behavior of something. And why that is important is because it gives you full visibility into what's happening in a certain asset environment. So it can be a manufacturing facility or building, and really understand what's going on there. I think during the design phase, going back to your question, when we calculate, we run these theoretical energy models and we simulate how a building is supposed to perform. We don't have enough visibility during the construction phase, the fit-out phase, commissioning and handover, and the first few years of operational maintenance. And many things can go wrong. So we try to account for many different factors, like glazing, the MEP installations, but we don't have visibility into what happens later on. And that's where a digital twin can come in, where you're able to spot the different underperforming zones in a certain space and really understand which factors, what actually went wrong and what you should invest in. So that's really tying. We're closing the loop between design and operation. Really, the challenges and the reason why I'm throwing around digital twin is because buildings generate large amounts of data, right? And it's really hard to understand what's going on unless you have that single source of truth. So it's all about data management and data contextualization, and that's where digital twin comes in.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Balsam, you know, we've sat in the buildings pavilion. It's not a built environment pavilion, it's a buildings pavilion. And we've sat in a green buildings industry for several decades now. But we don't just live in buildings, and buildings don't just exist in isolation. Buildings find themselves entwined with an urban environment, with transportation, with water, with waste, and with energy. How does this reality of a complex urban environment start to impact this urgent transition to net zero cities, and particularly the interplay between buildings and infrastructure?
So we're very much focused indeed on buildings, and we've been doing a lot of work on buildings, and we're doing well. But we can't continue just focusing on buildings. It needs to be the buildings and the infrastructure that serves them. It needs to be a holistic approach that we should be working around. Because what we found out is that working in silos might get us to missed opportunities. So when we work in an integrated approach, that's when we can make sure that we are providing those easy, workable solutions to the built environment. And that's how we would get effectively net zero city, ultimately. And one point to add here is that 75% of the infrastructure is yet to be built by 2050. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have to start thinking about them as a complementary set of systems rather than separate systems that operate each by itself, and hence the importance of the integrated approach that we are rallying.
Great. I do have an audience question, so can I take the mic very briefly, and we can pick one up there.
Hello, hi.
Hi, thank you.
I'm Mustafa, I'm with the Canadian delegation. I'm part of Next Generation Cities Lab. I just have quite of a complex question for several of our panelists. So first, I would like to ask Victoria, mainly like the talk and pledges and commitments to the net zero energy. It's quite a good thing. I agree totally. Personally, we did that over there in Canada. But my question comes to regulating is quite the issue here. There's no regulation for embodied carbon specifically in the UK or in Canada or in different places in the world. And this is quite the issue that we need, especially for the existing buildings. And I would like to ask, what do you think? Is it decarbonizing the grid, the problem, or decarbonizing the buildings? So that's the first thing. Second, my question is for Stephen. How do you see the business case for existing buildings in the MENA region specifically, because it's a developing region, so mainly there's new buildings rather than existing buildings. So what's the possibility of access to that? And the last part is for Faisal, and mainly I'm asking about if the digital twin project or tool, is it for just new buildings, for buildings that have been designed by DAR and then like employed, or is there a use case for it for existing buildings as well? Because that's quite the issue that we are facing, maybe in the North American region. So that's
Okay, thank you very much.
no questions.
Okay, so it seems I might be out of a moderating job after that. I'm just going to reiterate the three as I understand them. So Victoria, we've got an initial question around buildings. Is it the buildings issue? Is it greening the grid? And what about embodied carbon legislation? You might want to talk about LETI, I don't know. Then we have, for Stephen, a question around the business case, and particularly in emerging market economies, how are we seeing the business case emerge that's driving investment in this direction? And then Faisal, for you at the end, a question on digital twinning and existing buildings versus new build. Are there use cases beyond DAR and our new buildings? Victoria, you're up.
Okay, so quite a few layers to your question, but thank you for asking it. First of all,
Like an onion.
there's a timing issue, right? We mentioned earlier about how long it takes for a building or a building project to materialize, but you can switch energy sources to renewable energy, either on-site or with power purchase agreements or renewable energy certificates. We have that choice available in the market. But is there enough energy infrastructure with renewable sources and clean sources today to decarbonize the grids? No. So the reduction of energy consumption within our buildings helps to enable that transition, because the less we use, the less infrastructure we need, the faster the transition will happen, right? So that's part one. Part two is embodied carbon. And the big challenge on embodied carbon, in terms of the decades we've been working on this stuff, it's still fairly new to the industry in terms of trying to tackle it and understanding what it means. And again, it's about a lack of data. We can't expect regulators to set policies with targets if we don't know what those targets need to be and what good looks like. So one really good thing that's come from the Canada Zero Carbon Building Standard from the Green Building Council of Canada is they started with their first version of that standard to say, just measure. You know, don't worry about setting a target, just measure, just understand what the embodied carbon is of these projects. And then by the time 2 years later they came to reviewing the standard, industry wanted targets. So within a 2-year process, we went from we've got nothing, let's start with measuring, to standards, and now they've increased them again. So that's the process that policy takes. We have to prove from an industry point of view what's possible, and that means bringing the data together, sharing that data. You take a look at the Arab announcement from 2 days ago about what they're doing in terms of sharing the data from their projects, so that we can help create those databases and data sets to understand what good looks like. But even if there isn't a policy, I'm going to be really clear here, but even if there isn't a policy on embodied carbon, it's still important to look at as you're building a new building or designing a new building, because once you've made those choices about embodied carbon, that's it. The emissions have gone, there's nothing we can do about it. There's a time value to the carbon that means we have to be adjusting those now. It's not a consequential, we don't fix one problem and then deal with the next one, deal with the others. It's completely integrated.
Everything all together, all at once now. Stephen, do you want to jump in on that?
I just want to add one thing from the private sector perspective, representing DAR here. So regulations are very important. They're actually the priority to this. But also the private sector has a big role to play, and hence why we've undertaken the net zero commitment. Because we did feel that when we walk the talk, then that's when we'll start seeing implementation happen. And that's when our clients will come further to us to really also align with the net zero commitments. Now, that's in terms of the part of your question that's related to regulations and others. In terms of the embodied carbon, and just to Victoria's point, is that every region is different. So when we were advocates, and as we are advocates to the embodied carbon, also net zero vision, let's say, what we've done, or what we're doing specifically today, is that we're surveying the Middle East and Africa. So it's a market that is still yet to be developed in terms of embodied carbon. It's data that's still yet to be available for all of us, and we're working closely with suppliers and with market players to make sure that we understand how the market is moving, and that we implement this and we influence this whichever way we can based on our experience moving forward.
Stephen, the business case and how we make.
So I think let me go quick and let me simplify. So I think the question is that for financiers and for guys writing projects and actually looking to sustain it, it's a nuance, not a nuance. It's a pretty fundamental issue that greenfield's much easier than brownfield. And so if I'm planning a project, looking at a project, and so it makes it much easier to finance, to move, and to get excited about it. Whereas actually, a big part of the transition can't be that we're not refitting, retooling, redeveloping existing buildings. Now, and obviously that's in a fairly immature market like the Middle East. We are getting to the end of useful lives of a lot of buildings, and therefore what's happening with that? I mean, I think the good news, and I'll give a good example, something PwC did. So we had a choice 3 years ago to either build a new building or to repurpose a building. And And actually, from a sustainability perspective, it was actually almost, it would be easier to build a new building in a very sustainable way, which makes no sense. So actually what we did is we found an existing building and refitted and then put in all of the, now that was more painful, possibly more expensive, etc. to try and do that, but that's what we did because it was the right thing to do in terms of our people. When we're talking to our people around, they're driving what they want to see from us from a sustainability perspective. Now, how you then codify all of that into policies, procedures, practices to make that happen, we're a long way away.
Faisal, I think you're up next.
Thank you for your question. So it's definitely much easier to deploy a digital twin in a new building, especially if you're doing the design early on and you know exactly what the client wants, right? So you can add these future-proof features and components, and that way it becomes much smoother during deployment. But we definitely also deploy in brownfield facilities, so existing buildings that have been built, you can integrate with them. Legacy facilities, so buildings built before 1990, that's a bit trickier, but there's a way to do it, especially with IoT and retrofits. So the reason why I'm saying this is because 80% of the buildings that are around today will still be around in, by 2050, right? So we don't want to forget about them. So we also need to come up with an approach for the older buildings. And it's all about, at the end of the day, use cases and return on investment, right? So digital twins, there's this perception that it's cost prohibitive, it's commercially unappealing beyond the richest developers, which isn't true, right? It's only true if you don't find the right use cases that can translate into a bottom line ROI. So it's really important that you have engineers and domain experts, people who understand the space really well, come up with a solution.
Faisal, thank you. We do have another audience question. So Victoria, if you wouldn't mind passing the mic along.
Hi, I am with a company in United States called Carbon Quest, and we work in the US and also looking at Canada and helping buildings decarbonize. And we see that some cities now are starting to put penalties on building emissions, New York, Boston, and there's some confusion between should the policy be about lowering emissions however we can, as fast as we can, versus electrification is the only path. And we see building owners really struggling, especially institutional owners like hospitals, universities. They look at electrification and say, boy, that's really expensive for us right now. We'd like to do that later. Maybe we should either just do penalties, or they come to us. We do carbon capture in buildings. And we say, well, at least we can help you now with immediate decarbonization. So I'm curious what your reaction is to additional technologies in buildings in addition to just straight up electrification right away.
Victoria, please jump in.
Well, yeah, I'm not an engineer, so maybe not the best position to
It's okay, I am, and I'll correct you.
I mean, I think you're right in that it's a transition, and unfortunately, whether it's a carbon tax or a penalty from the city, you have to decide whether to take that penalty or make the investment in the building. It's about the longer term solution, and sometimes if you're not the building owner, maybe that's a difficult decision to make. We could maybe talk about the global Cook Save coalition as well, the kind of cooking sources, which often is a real barrier to electrification from a financial but also perceptual point of view. But yeah, maybe in terms of other technologies for electrification.
Hand over to Bassam. I might have a comment or two as well.
So first, thank you for your question. Definitely electrification is a great solution. It's not the only solution as we look at it. 100% electrification is something that we aim for, but definitely we are supportive, and that's how we're working. We are supportive of reduced emissions, and then alternative solutions that would also help us attain our targets. So anything that is aligned with those targets that would help us really reduce the GHG emissions is something that we would, let's say, support, rather than just 100% electrification and then penalties that are associated with it as we speak today. And I do hope that answers your question.
Perhaps I can just add one or two things, because I think it, while it's quite a specific use case, I think it's emblematic of a bigger economic challenge that we face. We have a whole bunch of sectors where the electrification of what we have is both expensive and technologically challenging. We're working in the transportation sector, and there are many transit agencies who say, well, we'll just roll out electric buses. And it seems like a really straightforward thing to do until you plan the utility upgrades that are required to take a 5 million person city's entire transit network onto a completely new energy source. So we face it in transportation. We face it in our existing heating networks. So in many places we've spoken about the hydrogen transition from fossil gas towards hydrogen. There are genuine market and engineering challenges, knotty, thorny, difficult challenges involved with actually moving sectors from one energy source to another. Now, part of that's an engineering solution. Part of that is the ability to upgrade substations and design microgrids and do all of those good things, and to electrify building heating systems. But occasionally that is really difficult, and we don't have time to wait. So we have to do what we can to improve the performance of our worst performing systems and aspects and built infrastructure in the built environment at the same time. In the long run, we're probably going to run most things on electricity. But I mean, we're probably talking a full building life cycle of asset upgrades and development before we get there, and we don't have a full building life cycle, asset life cycle, in order to get to zero emissions. So, I don't know. That's just a thought. I had another question. Sorry, there we go. Microphone. I'll take it.
Thank you so much. My name is Hussam from Dar. Actually, you all agreed that we are far away from where we need to be. And thank you, Victoria, for the terminology of filling the gap, which is quite interesting. So as we are in a COP for implementation, and this is the slogan of this COP, so we need to fill this gap. So we need to know from the built environment the role of each stakeholder. Who has the biggest role to fill this gap? Governments, NGOs, designers, AEC leaders, financial institutions, or the developers. Who do you think should lead on this, filling this gap and have this into actions? Not asking this to say, okay, we are designers, it's not our role, it's the governmental role. No, but we need to direct the questions and encourage our clients to do that, or our financial institute management companies that we deal with to do that, because they will have the biggest impact. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and paraphrase that into responsibilities for leadership.
So all of the ones that you've mentioned, they all have a role. It's not a one-man show, that's for sure. And each has a role differently. Now governments, they have to set regulations and policies, because we've seen that once the policy is in place, everybody wants to do it, not to pay the penalties. So that's one. Two, it's definitely the NGOs, and there's a lot of support that's coming, a lot of advocacy that's coming from this end. Three is the private sector, because we should be leading by example, which we are, and hopefully will always be. Four are the financial institutions, because if there's no money to do it, it cannot be done. Five is the generations that are to come, because that's where the influence will start. It's the communities, the youth generation, everyone that surrounds us that will impact us to make the change happen moving forward. Did I miss anyone?
You want to? Victoria wants to add.
One of the dangers is that any one of the people, the stakeholders that you've listed, believing that it's another stakeholder's responsibility to solve this problem, right? You can have an architect design a building and give it to the engineer and be like, make this net zero, when it's not been optimized in terms of those early decisions that they've made, and in fact have locked in some solutions and challenges. We're actually involved in the implementation lab for the Breakthrough Agenda next week on human settlements. It's at 12:30. And it will have a representation from each of those stakeholder groups to talk about exactly that, and talk about, they refer to them as levers in the Breakthrough Agenda that need to be pulled by different stakeholders at the same time in order to help us advance the goals. It's dangerous to say that we need to wait for regulation, because as we've heard, the private sector needs to demonstrate the possible in order for regulation to happen.
Okay, guys, we're nearly at time. Stephen, did you want to add to that, or can I go into my...
Maybe 5 seconds.
Go.
It's definitely not government and regulation. I think what we found on most transitions is consumers have moved quicker than governments do. And that's the sort of big hope, I think, for all of us. You look at what's driving electrification, say, in the car industry. It's not regulation. It's the manufacturers have started to do it because the consumers aren't going to buy non-electrified cars. So I think they're catching up. But yeah, the big hope is that consumers are going to drive this anyway.
Yeah. And business cases can be complex things. Guys, we're close to time. So we're up to the lever, the question that I prompted at the start. You've only got one thing each. One thing that you could do. The biggest lever that you have at your disposal, at our disposal. Would you leave us each with a closing comment on your one thing, your number one priority, if you could implement something coming out of this conference? Balsam, do you want to go first, or do you need a minute and we'll go to Victoria, because she's champing it?
I've been thinking about it since you
That's why I gave you a heads up.
I've got tons of different answers I could give to that question, but you mentioned, Mr. Talal, about choice at the beginning, right? So for me, it's about a choice whether to make a building net zero and to explain why you're choosing not to make a building net zero, because we're out of time, we have too many emissions from the sector, and we cannot afford, and it's inexcusable, to create high-emitting, inefficient, and unhealthy buildings. So it's about choice to choose not to make a building net zero. We have to walk away with that framing in our mind. Why am I choosing not to make this building net zero?
Absolutely. Faisal.
I think for me, something I'd like to see is more transparency when it comes to emissions, right,
Yeah.
from companies, because people, the community, people care, right? They care about what businesses do. That data isn't out there, isn't disclosed enough, isn't granular enough. So that's something I'd like to see happen.
I'll commit heresy. So I'd love to see the end of the term ESG. Not a big fan.
So glad I didn't ask you about it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a term dreamt up by bankers in the financial markets to justify investments. What I'd like to see is actually people just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And for our region, it's 100% the right thing to do. So if you're going to be credible with consumers, and you're going to be credible in your communities, your essence, your purpose, your projects have to tick the environmental box. They have to create social improvement. They've got to create jobs. They've got to create diversity, and they've got to be done in a well-governed way. So my hope is this thing just becomes a bit like digital. People are not necessarily talking about digital anymore. It just happens, and the ESG will just become and sustainability and environment will become so ingrained. We don't even have to make the choice because we've moved on.
Balsam?
I'll just say 3 words: awareness, advocacy, and clarity.
Thank you so much. You took my last one, because I was going to leave a closing comment around advocacy. And I just want to share with everyone, one thing we can all do is learn to advocate better in this whole gig, in this whole challenge. The voices at the table have not been even-handed. And so if you're at this sort of conference and you're doing this sort of thing, use every lever that you have to advocate for high ambition, whole of life emissions reduction in every interaction you have in the built environment. And on that note, everybody, I'd like you to thank our panelists. Panelists, thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure. Thank you to the Buildings Pavilion, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your COP27. Thank you. Should probably return the microphone to people.